Hello, my name is Tyson Witcher, and this is my wife Joyce Witcher. I'm going to teach you about Common Core and Smarter Balance testing and how we got here, going over the first 3 weeks of our class. And just want to ask my wife a couple questions. What is your job other than being a mom? What were you doing before you stayed home?
I was a medical social worker.
And to become a medical social worker, was there a certain type of test that you had to take? And if there was, can you describe it?
Well, there is not a like a competency test to get your master's in social work. You would do depending on your school. My school, we had to do a thesis project in order to graduate. But to get licensed, there is a big test where you have to have done clinical hours, and then you sit and be tested on a bunch of theories, laws, ethics, things like that.
Now, is this a multiple choice test, written response, or do you know anything about it yet?
If it's like the law and ethics, it's multiple choice.
It's multiple choice. So we're seeing from my wife, she's looking at that old style of standardized testing, the CST format. We remember taking those tests when I was in high school in the early 2000s, and the Scantron test, and just doing that at the end of the school year, not knowing exactly why you did it and not getting a lot of feedback. Everyone took the same test. It's actually pretty interesting to understand that this type of standardized testing comes from this idea of having civil servants in the Chinese empires, making sure they are all adequate servants and civil servants for their bureaucracy, and they all had to be there. So standardized testing has been around a long, long time. Now, I wanted to go a little bit back into detail, and standardized testing can be affiliated to our school system, and our political government at the time. Can you think of any president in your lifetime, going from Reagan all the way to Trump? Can you think of any of their education stances or education programs?
Well, I think it was Bush that did the No Child Left Behind. Is that what I believe? That was that's only what I remember.
So, I mean, we know that George W. Bush was the governor of Texas and was very into education. And for him, he had No Child Left Behind, which was that idea that every child's going to succeed. And I think it's interesting because Reagan's Secretary of Education came out with this idea called a nation at risk, and just talked about where we are and where we need to be. Actually, Reagan didn't end up following it. George H.W. Bush had Goals 2000. Clinton took those ideas and created a national leadership of education and standardizations, but there wasn't federal regulations. Then we come to George W. Bush, and we have the No Child Left Behind. And then eventually we come to President Obama and Common Core and Smarter Balance testing. Now, we could always debate about our current president with his stance on education, but I think it's a little too fresh to really know what his full stance is. But I think it's interesting to understand that these are phases that have happened, and they've been championed by the president at the time. But the president is not the only one who makes a difference on education. Can you think of any other groups that would make a difference on education and standardization?
Well, like in California, isn't it the teachers union?
Oh, there we go. Yeah, you have California State Government's Teachers Union. These are important because they are interest groups, and the Teachers Union of California is an interest group, and they make an idea. They lobby to what laws are going to get passed in California. And of course, we have the California government. The Constitution does not say that education is a right of the national government, but a right of the state government. But if we accept funding from the national government, we have to follow their guidelines. But another big area is big business, because we think about it, they are the ones who would need the workforce. And the workforce, it needs to be educated in a certain way from K through 12, So when they get into the working world, they're ready to go. So I think it's important to understand in education, there's a lot of factors that influence it. Now, I wanted to ask you this. You may not know that because you're not in education. Do you know the difference between summative and formative assessment?
Summative, I would imagine it has to do with like summarizing. Formative sounds like it would be where you're actually doing research, getting numbers. I don't know if that's even right.
You know what? I think that's a great educated guess. Summative means it comes at the end.
Oh, okay.
And it's kind of a summation of everything.
Oh,
and you're not doing it to change your teaching it, you're doing it to evaluate your students.
Oh, okay.
Formative, we think of that word formal in there, but formative means that this is going to change the way you teach. So I kind of think of it this way. Summative assessment would be a chapter test, where a formative would be a quiz. But you can use it's kind of like not all multiple choice tests or short answers are necessarily summative or formative. It's the data you use with them. Now, at my school, Norris Middle School, where I teach at, we have a mantra that I walk by every day. It says, know your content, know your students, and know your data. And I think, actually, myself, the first time I got introduced to Google Classroom and the Google Suite was from my wife when she was doing her master's thesis. Because I'm like, how is everyone writing on this document?
Oh yeah.
So if you could explain that a little bit, how did that work?
So it was a project class, but we had to just do like group Google Docs, do group editing because we all lived in different places. I actually lived in Bakersfield. I went to Cal State Long Beach, and so that way we could all be on time. We'd do like Google Hangouts and like do things and talk and without having to like meet because it's easier in your own home and it's a little more convenient that way.
The cool thing about that Google Suite is that you could all change one document and make changes, and you know who's making changes. And I think this is a great tool for education, the Smarter, Balanced, and Common Core, because it's definitely collaborative, and it does not have to just focus in one classroom where you guys are all on the same computer. So I use Google Classroom in my classroom mainly because the data is so immediate and it's kept on a cloud where I can get access to it anytime. I don't have to save it anywhere in particularly. Now, Google Classroom's role in formative assessment is that it changes everything. You can change it on the fly. Today, for example, I made a Google assignment and I realized it wasn't working, so for the next class I updated it. Now, I think another big idea in Common Core in Smarter Balanced testing is peer review and assessment. Now, Joyce, you are in the social work field and you have to write notes, right?
Yes.
When you first started your internships, were your notes the best?
No, and they'd have to get proofread.
So that's the peer review that we see in the working world for my wife. And that peer review and assessment allows us to critique each other, but also add feedback to say what needs to be there. Now, at my school, we study a guy named John Hattie, who is known for effect size, and his effect size, he wants 1 year's worth of content and 1 year's worth of growth or more. And a couple things we talk about is teacher efficacy and also student review and assessment. And the goal is to have that growth. So things that are under that 1 year's growth in 1 year's growth in 1 year's time aren't worth doing. Now, I want to go a little farther too and talk about depth of knowledge versus Bloom's taxonomy. Now, you may not have known it, but we grew up under this Bloom's taxonomy. If you can remember, kind of like Maslow's hierarchy of needs, there's a top and there's a bottom. But Bloom's taxonomy is switched around in the depth of knowledge chart, and it becomes a circular thing that you could go back and forth to. So it's not necessarily like Bloom's taxonomy where you start at the bottom and you end the chapter at the top. In the depth of knowledge chart, you could start in the middle, go back to the beginning, go to the end, go back to the middle, and go through these different learning styles. So it's important to understand that Bloom's taxonomy has developed into the depth of knowledge chart. Now, I think it's also important to understand that we haven't really talked about the testing of the Smarter Balance. Now, I teach U.S. history, and ever since the CST went away, we haven't had a U.S. history exam. But I've been looking at the Smarter Balance for 8th grade ELA, and it is very content-based, and a lot of it are primary sources or even nonfiction, which I think is a real difference than when I was in high school, because in high school we were so developed on novels and pieces of literature. Do you remember your high school education and what novels or pieces of literature that you read?
So we read John Steinbeck's Grapes of Wrath,
Uh-huh.
and then Of Mice and Men,
Mm-hmm.
and The Perks. I think we did read The Perks of Being a Wallflower in honors English.
So it's like you're reading literature, stuff that is classics and stuff more modern literature. But it's interesting I don't really remember all the nonfiction stuff I read. I remember the fiction. I don't know if it was the same for you, but you remember that and you're tested on it, which is all good. I think being culturally aware is good, but a lot of these kids are missing out on nonfiction texts, stuff that they're going to be using in the real world. I mean, in your social work career, are you reading the classics of literature, or is it mainly nonfiction, reviews and studies? What is it?
Reviews, studies, therapies.
So yeah, you're reading a lot of nonfiction. So the Smarter Balance test is going really deep with that nonfiction. And they're not just asking you easily multiple choice questions, but they're asking you to cite evidence. They're asking you to choose the best answer, not just the correct answer. So there's a lot of defining. So the Smarter Balance test, I think if we understand it in the Bloom's taxonomy, depth of knowledge, you're going at the higher level. You're not just at that base level where it's just recognition of it and just memorization, but you got to think deeper. And with that, we hate to say that we're teaching for the test, but in standardization and test taking, we got to make sure that people know, because, like you said, Joyce, you're going to take a test to become a certified social worker? Licensed. Well, I should know that. I'm sorry. But it's important to understand is that we want these kids to be aware of when they do get evaluated in the future. And we want all these skills to transfer either from when they're going to be a student to go to higher education or even to start their career. So it's important to understand that the Smarter Balance testing is changing everything about that, and it's trying to gear the kids to be critical thinkers. And I think a big part of that critical thinking is pretty much understanding that you have to think deeper and think critically, and you just don't learn history in history or English in English or science in science, but it's cross-curricular. So that's very important. For example, my wife's a social worker. She's worked in hospice. She's worked at the hospitals. She's worked with children's and elderly patients. And finding where she fits in is very, very important. Now, I think it's also important that we talk about we read 2 readings about Tom Torkelson's and Tony Thurman's kind of ideas about education. And I always think that this Smarter, Balanced, and Common Core is a living document. It can always be changed. It can always be updated. Because looking at their kind of scopes of learning, it's important to realize what everything changes. When we were in high school, the needs change now. So just kind of on this last question is, we have 3 kids. We have Oliver, Abraham, and Eliana. Oliver's in kindergarten right now. What do you hope, I'm just going to give you a little snapshot. What do you hope that our kids would be able to do by the time they finish elementary school? What are the skills that you would want them to know?
The skills would be to write, like complete sentences, some basic skills like tying your shoes, like properly cutting with scissors, and being able to read. I don't know if I said that.
Yeah, and I would go a little deeper too. I mean, we want them to also, when our elementary school at my district goes all the way to 6th grade, so socialization is important, leadership skills, understanding how to analyze and critique and create your own opinions. And I think it's important because we remember certain things about our school year, about our beginnings of school, and we need to understand that we're trying to get these kids ready for the 2020s, and technology is a big deal with this, understanding that the workforce has changed completely. So just to conclude, this first 3 weeks have opened my eyes a lot. Currently at my school, we just adopted a new curriculum for U.S. history, and I would say it's more of a blend of language arts and U.S. history, because they're asking us to do certain things. Now, for me, I try my best to use summative and formative assessments. Something I need to work on is when you create summative, they want you to create the test first and then work towards that. I don't do that right now. Formative assessments, I'm doing better. I use an app on my phone called Class Cards, which allows me to randomize and grade students on the fly and really look at that data intently. But also, I think it's important to understand is, how am I not just going to bend to Common Core and Smarter Balance testing, but make it my own? So I want to thank my lovely wife for helping me out, and hopefully you enjoyed this. Thank you.